Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to another close analysis of Cassandra Clare's Chain of Gold. I think we've got about 3 more videos to go, including this one. We are so near the end. Thank you to everyone that has been with me from the start of this journey. If anyone's joined me halfway through, for all those that came from my recent BookTube newbie tag, hello and welcome. We're so near the end, so let's do this thing. As usual, small disclaimer, this is by no means a book review. I won't be talking about the larger plot points. I will only be mentioning the small details and references to the other books in the Shadowhunter Chronicles, as well as any information I think could be important for the next 2 books in the Last Hours trilogy. I'm getting to the point now where I'm starting to think of Chain of Iron theories and what's going to happen in the next book. If you'd like me to do a Chain of Iron theories video, please let me know in the comments. I will only do this if you guys are interested, but I do have a few thoughts I would love to share with you. So without further ado, let's begin analysing chapters 17, 18 and 19 of Chain of Gold. Okay, I want to begin with an important interaction between Matthew and Cordelia. So Cordelia asks Matthew what the green flower he wears in his buttonhole represents. And Matthew says, the green carnation symbolises a love of art and artifice, since a green carnation has to be created rather than appearing in nature. It also celebrates loving anyone you choose, whether that is a man or a woman. So this symbol of wearing a green carnation in your buttonhole was actually a symbol of the gay community in Edwardian London, as popularised by the novelist Oscar Wilde. Cassie has actually mentioned this before in her replies on Tumblr. I will try to find the thread and leave it in the bio below. So I really love this edition that Matthew wears. I think it's a really nice nod to how he feels comfortable in himself and his sexuality. I also have a slight theory with this flower. I don't know where, when or who put it on, but I swear I saw someone say that the green carnation also means forgiveness. If that's anything to go by, I really hope this is a subtle allusion to Matthew being forgiven for what he did to Charlotte in the Ghost of the Shadow Market story. I highly recommend reading it before Chain of Iron comes out, or even if you're going to read Chain of Gold another time. This story is really important, and it gives you such a massive insight into the way that Matthew is feeling throughout the events in Chain of Gold, and you will really understand just why he acts and thinks the way that he does. This point actually leads me nicely along to a little further down in the same conversation with Matthew and Cordelia, when Cordelia questions just why Matthew does act like this, and he says, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." So a tiny insight into something that could happen in Chain of Iron. Will Matthew express his feelings to Cordelia about what he did in the past? Will he come clean and own up to his mistake? And what repercussions will this have on him and the rest of the Merry Thieves that he was keeping it a secret from? Shortly after Matthew drops Cordelia back at her house, James then comes over to drop off Cortana, and Cordelia greets her sword in one of the best ways possible. So she says, "Cortana, moosh moosham, I'm glad you're back." To which James cleverly picks up that she's just used a term of endearment for her sword. Not only is this totally fine by me, because if I was the owner of Cortana, I would be using so many pet names for that magnificent sword, but this is also a nice nod to, I think, the Welsh Herondales using Welsh terms of endearment like Cariad in their conversations. If Cordelia really does marry James and go into the Herondale family, I think she will fit in just fine. Cordelia then leans Cortana against the fireplace grate, and Cassie notes that she's not worried about the heat tarnishing the blade because nothing did. For those of you that watched my last video, you will remember my theory about Cortana potentially burning Cordelia. I think this is a nice little bit of foreshadowing used by Cassie in this paragraph, and I really can't wait to find out why does Cortana act like this. So back to the Institute, and Lucy and Jessamine are having a lovely conversation in Lucy's room when Jessie just appears out of nowhere. A wash of cold went over Lucy. She pulled the blankets up around her, looking around the room anxiously. "Jessie?" He materialised at the foot of the bed in the same black trousers and shirt sleeves he always wore. So the note that I made here was, imagine just having 2 ghosts being able to come and go in your room. Lucy literally has no privacy because Jessamine is always there talking about how much better than Lucy she was, how she used to brush her hair all the time, how she was prettier, used to wear nicer clothes. As if this isn't bad enough, Jessie, who Lucy definitely does fancy at this point, appears when he wants, no prior warning, and just materialises and sits on her bed. bed. I feel really bad for Lucy. She literally cannot get away from her ghostly powers at this point. After chapter 17, there's a nice little flashback to 1901 with Matthew walking around London in the dark, which is eerily juxtaposed with the death of Queen Victoria. This mini chapter is so short, it is literally Matthew just talking about how he has sinned, how he's done something wrong, and how he can never forgive himself. But the final line, after all, he had committed murder, shocked me so much when I first read Chain of Gold. So, like a fool, I didn't actually read the two Ghosts of the Shadow Market stories before I read Chain of Gold. I read them, I think, a couple of weeks after I read Chain of Gold. And when I first read this line, I screamed. I cannot tell you what went through my head. I was like, Matthew seems such a nice guy. Like, yeah, he's got a few problems and a few issues that he needs to deal with. But murder? Honestly, I was so confused. Again, I'm going to hammer in the point that you have to read those two Ghosts of the Shadow Market stories before you read Chain of Iron. I won't tell you exactly what Matthew did. I feel like I might have already mentioned it in a past video, and if I have, I'm really sorry about that. That is a huge spoiler. And yes, by some accounts, it is murder, but I think when Cassie writes this final sentence, you literally think he's gone out and just killed loads of men in London. Like I said, I understand why he feels the way he does and why he feels so guilty about what he actually did, but when I tell you my brain exploded with all these ideas and things that he could have done, I am not lying. At the start of chapter 18, we are back in Matthew's house, in particular in the lab at the bottom of the house where Christopher and Henry like to work together. So James goes down to the lab and he notices that on a plinth rested the Colt single action army revolver Christopher and Henry had been working on for months before all this had happened. Its river grey nickel plating was deeply engraved with runes and a curving inscription, Luke 12:49. So remember that Christopher is obsessed with trying to make mundane technology useful for Shadowhunters, but the thing that really interested me here was the biblical reference. So the line from Luke 49 is, "I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled." Obviously there's a reason Cassie chose this passage, and please feel free to leave your analysis of this passage below, but the way that I read this, I think this revolver is going to be very important in one of the next two books. I feel like somehow Christopher and Henry will get this revolver working with a Shadowhunter's hands. This whole idea of fire that's in this biblical reference relates so much to Cortana and the burning. Please let me know what you think of this object in the comments below. It honestly couldn't mean anything, but I do think there's a reason that Cassie has chosen this exact biblical reference to have engraved on the gun. There's a nice little joke about Thomas's feelings for Alistair. So Matthew jokes that Thomas has actually already gone senile because Matthew gets the feeling that he rather likes Alistair, which of course is hilarious because he has no idea of Thomas's true feelings for Alistair Carstairs. I think this is a nice little throwaway line to the fact that Tom Stair hopefully is going to be a thing in Chain of Iron and even in Chain of Thorns as well. I cannot wait for these scenes. I am such a Tom Stair stan. Shortly after this, there's a weird little moment between James and Matthew when James picks up the way that Matthew actually says Cordelia's name, which literally made me scream. I don't know how I feel about Cordelia and Matthew as a couple. I really just love James and Cordelia. At this point, I just ship Matthew with happiness and a good sense of well-being. Also, a few days ago, Cassie revealed that Matthew does end up revealing his true feelings to Cordelia. She said that he was going to do this in Chain of Iron, and I am not ready for this conversation. If you guys know, Cassie has actually hinted that there is going to be a love triangle in the Last Hour series, but she said it's going to be a love triangle that's completely different to anyone that she's done before. So obviously the love triangle in the Infernal Devices, the plot twist was that they both actually end up with Tessa and that she loved them both equally. She didn't have to choose between them. And then in the Dark Artifices, Kieran, Mark and Christina actually enter into a polyamorous relationship at the end of the series, which is a very different type of love triangle. Although let's be honest, if Jem didn't die, who's to say that her and Carstairs wouldn't be a thing? But this is a separate video and a separate conversation. So what could the love triangle between James, Cordelia and Matthew be? One of my favourite fan theories is that it will be an unrequited love triangle. I feel like the two aforementioned triangles have been full of requited love, but what if Cordelia doesn't feel the same way that Matthew feels about her? Technically, this is a different type of love triangle that Cassie hasn't done yet, so that's my biggest theory for how this is going to go down. There's a nice little mother-daughter moment between Sona and Cordelia when Cordelia suddenly gets the letter about about Christopher being wounded and has to go to the Devil's Tavern to meet with her friends. So she wants to put on her gear, but her gear is still wet from when she got thrown into the River Thames. Sona actually says, "Layla, my daughter, you can wear mine." So the particular scene that I thought of that paralleled this really nicely was in one of the Mortal Instruments books when Clare is staying in Amethyst's house in Alicante and she goes through Amethyst's things and steals her gear. Obviously this isn't the same because Sona actually gives Cordelia her gear, whereas Clare steals it without her realising, but I thought it was a really nice parallel between the two series. There's another Cordelia and Matthew conversation that I want to pick up on when Matthew and Cordelia are discussing James's love for Grace and James's possible affections for Cordelia as well, and Cordelia asks Matthew why he is so bothered about what he saw in the whispering room between Cordelia and James, and he says, "I don't know, but I find that I do care." This line actually gave me feelings towards one of the scenes in Clockwork Angel when Jem gets really ill and he asks for Tessa to go to his bedside and they end up talking about Jem's inevitable death. Tessa, stubborn as always, says, "Well, I don't want you to die. I don't know why I feel it so strongly. I've just met you, but I don't want you to die." Not only is this a key line of Cassie alluding to a possible Jessa romance and Tessa's feelings for Jem starting to develop, but I do see a really nice parallel between this conversation and the one between Matthew and Cordelia in Chain of Gold. I do stand by my point that Cassie is purposely juxtaposing Lucy and Jesse's relationship to that of Tessa and Jem, but for some reason I still connected these two scenes together as well. At the end of chapter 18, James, Matthew and Cordelia end up going to the Silent City to visit the sick, and there's that really creepy scene when all the people who are injured start chanting James's name. At this point, James knows that he has to go through the gateway and he says in his most dramatic Carindale voice, "It's about me. It's always been about me. I have no other choice." Not only is this a performance that his father would be very, very proud of, but it raises the same question I have said about 7 times at this point. Why is James superior to Lucy? I'm just curious. No way, I love James in his own right, but I do feel like Lucy gets the short end of the stick sometimes. So whilst these three are in the Silent City, Lucy and Thomas actually go to Chiswick House to try and get one of the last ingredients for the antidote. There's a really, really lovely reference to one of the scenes in Clockwork Princess at this point, when Cassie mentions the ruinous gardens in Chiswick House, and in particular the marble statues of Virgil, Sophocles and Ovid that have been smashed to jagged pieces which protruded upwards from broken plinths. If you remember, the destruction of these statues was due to Benedict Lightwood becoming Benedict Lightworm. I'm going to actually read out the point of reference because it's such a funny little section of this book. I just love it to pieces. "The worm yelped and spun, humping its body away from them with incredible speed. As it slithered away, a flick of its tail caught the edge of a statue and squeezed it tightly. The statue exploded into dust, showering into the dry ornamental pool. By the angel, it just crushed Sophocles," noted Will, as the worm vanished behind a large structure shaped like a Greek temple. "Has no one respect for the classics these days?" R.I.P. these statues. This is such a great reference. I really, really did appreciate it. Alright, I have a crazy theory. Throughout Chain of Gold, Grace is always known as a Shadowhunter who is really, really untrained and can't actually defend herself at all. During the previous attack on the bridge, her only tactic is to just run away, which, to be honest, girls, same. But also as a Shadowhunter, this kind of isn't acceptable. Similarly, in chapter 19, amidst the conversation between Grace and Lucy, a demon appears and looms above Grace to the point that she shrieks aloud, drops her witchlight torch and runs away. Nothing unusual here, right? But have you ever considered that perhaps she is pretending? So one of my lovely viewers actually pointed out that in the Midnight Heir from the Bane Chronicles, Grace acts like a trained Shadowhunter. So the particular passage that I'm talking about is when Magnus goes over to visit Tatiana and she asks him to do her evil bidding, and when he's leaving the house he actually bumps into Grace herself. So Magnus is really worried about Grace and he thinks that she's a prisoner in her own home, and he asks her if she needs any help, to which Cassie writes, "Grace moved with such speed that it was as if she were a bolt of lightning wrapped in muslin, the long gleaming blade flying from her skirts to her hand. She held the glittering point against Magnus's chest over his heart." Here was a Shadowhunter, Magnus thought. Tatiana had learned something from the mistakes of her father. She had the girl trained. "I am no prisoner here." "No?" Magnus asked. "Then what are you?" Grace's awful, awe-inspiring eyes narrowed. They were glittering like the steel, and were, Magnus was sure, no less deadly. I am my mother's blade. That is not something you say unless you know you can back it up. Worst case scenario of this theory is that this is a discontinuity issue and that Cassie decided between the Bane Chronicles and the publishing of Chain of Gold that it fit Grace's character to be defenseless and untrained. But best case scenario, Grace is doing a really good job at pretending to be helpless. Back to the Silent City, and James has decided to go through the gateway himself, with Cordelia and Matthew waiting at the other end with a rope which is tethered to James's body. There's a really nice farewell moment when Cordelia leans over and kisses James swiftly on the cheek. She sees him blink and touches fingers to the spot in surprise, to which she then pleads him to come back. Is this not the same moment in Clockwork Angel when Will and Jem are going to the Dark Sisters' house to investigate, and they leave Tessa at the Institute, but before they go, Tessa and Jem have a tiny farewell moment themselves? Prepare for major Jessa feels here. Tessa, Jem said, I didn't mean to say goodbye, she said quickly, but it seems odd to let you leave without saying anything at all. He looked at her curiously. He did something that surprised her then and took her hand, turning it over. She looked down at it, at her bitten fingernails, the still healing scratches along the backs of her fingers. He kissed the back of it, just a light touch of his mouth, and his hair, as soft and light as silk, brushed her wrist as he lowered his head. She felt a shock go through her, strong enough to startle her, and she stood speechless as he straightened, his mouth curving into a smile. Mizpah, he said. Don't tell me that is not the same scene but a generation later. James really is his mother's son, not knowing that he's getting these feelings for a Carstairs. And Cordelia really is Jem's cousin, giving the person that they are beginning to fall in love with some signs of physical affection that send a jolt or shock through the other person's body. This parallel is just chef's kiss. Top tier. There's two really minor points that I want to bring up as James enters this new dimension. One of them is Cassie's description of the world beyond the archway being black and grey. This might just be because I read into every single description, but I kind of feel like this is a nice little reference to James's ancestors, black being Will's colourings. Tessa always mentioned in the Infernal Devices that Will always had this super dark midnight black raven hair, and he was very much the dark contrast to Jem's very much light and silver profile. Then obviously the grey is a reference to Tessa, both her surname and the colour of her eyes, which are constantly mentioned in the Infernal Devices as well. The way that I read this is that James is discovering his ancestors, but also passing through his other ancestors to get there. The other point is James's shock at Belial's form, particularly the fact that he shows himself in his most human form rather than this sort of monster that James was picturing. Not only is this really funny because what an absolute shock to find this. It reminds me of the project that Cassie recently did with the other Cassie, the illustrator, when they created this series of amazing artwork of the 9 Princes of Hell. Can I just say, if one of these men asked me on a date, I would definitely say yes. Why does Belial look this attractive? This is not okay. The last point I want to make is another point about Lucy Herondale. So, when she finds out that her brother and Cordelia are in trouble, she demands that Jessie takes her to Highgate Cemetery. And when I say demand, she literally commands this. On a lighter note, this is actually quite a funny scene because Jessie is really pissed off with Lucy ordering him around and sort of says like, do not command me to do that, like I don't want to do this, and she's like, tough, take me anyway. But on a more serious note, what is her power? I am so intrigued. How can she command the dead like this? I need to know more. How am I meant to wait until March next year to find this out? Right, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please give it a like if you've enjoyed the content, and remember to subscribe for more content like this, as well as more discussion about my favourite genre, young adult fiction. I hit another new milestone today with 80 subscribers. For that, I am so grateful. A huge shout out to each and every one of you watching this, and I'll see you next time for more Chain of Gold discussion.